There's a silent battle fought in the heart of every man, a war between the quiet whisper of ambition and the thunderous roar of what if. It's the story of the road not taken, not because it was dangerous, but because the path you were on, however dull, felt safe. And sometimes, friend, the greatest risk you ever take is believing that playing it safe means you won't lose. You just lose slowly, piece by agonizing piece, until you look around and realize the only empire you built was a cage, and you're the only one locked inside. Vince knew that cage well. He lived in it, breathed its stale air, and felt its invisible bars press against him every waking hour. 42 years old, he worked the third shift at the auto parts plant, a place that smelled permanently of oil, metal dust, and forgotten dreams. When you saw Vince, you saw a man carved from necessity, a man who'd learned to carry the world on his shoulders without complaint. His frame was solid, not bulky, but dense, like a seasoned oak that had weathered 1,000 storms. He moved with a practiced economy, each step precise, each motion of his hands deliberate. Those hands were a story in themselves. Knuckles thick and calloused, nails always a little grimy no matter how much he scrubbed. They were hands that had known honest work since he was old enough to hold a wrench. They were the hands of a provider, a protector, the kind of hands that could fix a leaky faucet, change a tire in the pouring rain, or steady a trembling child. But they were also the hands of a man who held back, who gripped tight to what he had for fear of letting go, even for a moment. His face was a roadmap of responsibility. Lines etched themselves around his eyes, not from laughter but from years of squinting at blueprints, inspecting faulty parts, and more often than not, staring into the dark with a mind racing. His jaw was often set, giving him a gruff, unapproachable look, but if you caught his eyes when he thought no one was looking, you'd see a quiet observation, a depth that hinted at more than just the daily grind. They were tired eyes, yes, but not empty. They held the remnants of ambition, buried deep under layers of practicality and a heavy dose of caution. He was a man of few words, Vince, preferring to listen, to watch, to absorb. He trusted his own judgment, but only after he'd chewed on every possible outcome, every potential pitfall, until the idea was either too bruised to pursue or too late to matter. He was dependable, fiercely loyal to the few he called friends, and fair to a fault. But beneath that stoic surface, a current of anxiety hummed, a constant drone about the future, about money, about whether he was doing enough, or worse, if he was doing all the wrong things by doing nothing at all. They say a man can spend his whole life standing at the edge of a great ocean, dreaming of what lies beyond, but never dip his toes in the water. He might spend years building the perfect boat in his mind, drawing up the blueprints, imagining the sails catching the wind. But then the wind might be too strong, the waves too high, the boat not quite sturdy enough. And so he stays on the shore, convinced he's made the wise choice, safe from the storm. What he doesn't realize is that the real storm isn't out on the water. It's the quiet erosion of his own soul, watching the horizon grow distant, always wondering what he missed. It's the slow, steady hum of regret, building over decades, drowning out the possibilities he never dared to explore. It's the unspoken, what if, that becomes a whisper, then a sigh, then a heavy silence that settles over a man's life like dust on an old photograph. Vince knew that feeling, though he wouldn't have put it in such poetic terms. To him, it was just common sense. You worked hard, you kept your head down, you provided. No sense rocking the boat. At 42, he'd been punching the clock at the same precision parts factory for 20 years, his name tag, Vince, almost a permanent fixture on his blue work shirt. The clang and hum of the machines were the soundtrack to his life, a constant, grinding rhythm that echoed the steady, unadventurous beat of his days, each one a carbon copy of the last. It wasn't a bad life, not by any stretch. It was stable, predictable, safe, and that, he'd always believed, was the highest virtue. But even the safest harbor can become a trap if you never leave it. His hands, though, those were the storytellers. Those same hands that had been doing honest work since he was old enough to hold a wrench. They were the hands of a provider, a protector, the kind of hands that could fix a leaky faucet, change a tire in the pouring rain, or steady a trembling child. But they were also the hands of a man who held back, who gripped tight to what he had for fear of letting go, even for a moment. His face was a roadmap of responsibility. Lines etched themselves around his eyes, not from laughter but from years of squinting at blueprints, inspecting faulty parts, and more often than not staring into the dark with a mind racing. His jaw was often set, giving him a gruff, unapproachable look, but if you caught his eyes when he thought no one was looking, you'd see a quiet observation, a depth that hinted at more than just the daily grind. They were tired eyes, yes, but not empty. They held the remnants of ambition, buried deep under layers of practicality and a heavy dose of caution. He was a man of few words, Vince, preferring to listen, to watch, to absorb. He trusted his own judgment, but only after he'd chewed on every possible outcome, every potential pitfall, until the idea was either too bruised to pursue or too late to matter. He was dependable, fiercely loyal to the few he called friends, and fair to a fault. But beneath that stoic surface, a current of anxiety hummed, a constant drone about the future, about money, about whether he was doing enough, or worse, if he was doing all the wrong things by doing nothing at all. He lived in that modest, well-maintained, single-story house in an older, quiet, working-class neighborhood, a testament to his dedication, if not his daring. The small, tidy backyard, meticulously kept, was a reflection of his need for order and control. Maria, his wife, was the steady anchor, the warmth that kept the house from feeling like just four walls and a roof. Elena, 15, with her quick wit and even quicker smile, and Leo, 12, a whirlwind of boundless energy and questions, were his universe. Every bolt he tightened, every shift he endured, every penny he saved was for them. Their security was his fortress, built brick by brick with caution and hard labor. Yet this fortress meant to protect also felt like a prison sometimes. He watched the world change around him, watched younger guys, fresh out of trade school, talk about apps and online businesses, side hustles that could turn into something bigger. A flicker of envy, quickly extinguished by a dose of realism, would sometimes spark in his gut. His own ambitions, once bright and clear in his youth, had long since been filed away, gathering dust in the back corners of his mind like old schematics for a project that never got off the ground. He'd convince himself they weren't practical, not for a man with a family, a mortgage, and a steady job. A good job, he reminded himself. A safe job. The kind of job his father had and his father before him. The kind of job that didn't ask for big risks, only consistent effort. He was a man who believed in the paved road, even if it led nowhere new. The idea of veering off, even just a little, felt like a betrayal of everything he stood for, everything he had worked for. It felt like an invitation to ruin, a catastrophic leap into the unknown that would jeopardize everything he'd carefully built. He feared failure so intensely, he often preempted it by simply never trying. That quiet yearning for something more fulfilling was a ghost in his chest, a constant, dull ache he mostly ignored, but which occasionally flared, a painful reminder of the chasm between the man he was and the man he'd once dreamed of becoming. The relentless buzz of the alarm clock set for 5:00 a.m. was the first sound Vince heard almost every damn weekday. It wasn't a gentle chime or a soothing melody. It was a harsh, insistent drone that dragged him from the shallow pool of sleep back into the cold reality of another identical Tuesday or Wednesday or Friday. His hand, calloused and thick from years of gripping wrenches and hoisting steel, would grope for the snooze button, a brief, futile rebellion against the inevitable. But he never actually snoozed. Habit, stronger than any fleeting desire for a few more minutes of oblivion, pulled him upright. He'd swing his legs over the side of the bed, the familiar creak of the springs a testament to years of service, just like him. Downstairs, the coffee maker, programmed the night before by Maria, would already be gurgling its welcome. He'd pour himself a mug, black, no sugar, and stand by the kitchen window, watching the streetlights blink out one by one, surrendering to the creeping dawn. The air in the house was still, pregnant with the quiet breath of his sleeping wife and children. Elena, his 15-year-old, probably dreaming of college or some boy band. Leo, 12, undoubtedly wrestling imaginary dragons in his sleep. Their future, their security, was a weight Vince carried, a constant, heavy presence in his gut. By 5:45 a.m., he was in his beat-up sedan, the engine groaning a little louder each year, joining the procession of identical cars heading towards the sprawling concrete and steel complex on the outskirts of town. The factory floor was a beast of noise and motion. The rhythmic clang of presses, the high-pitched whine of grinders, the deep thrum of conveyors, it was a symphony of industrial might that had long since stopped being a novelty and had become the monotonous soundtrack to his existence. He worked his station, mindlessly performing the precise, repetitive tasks he'd mastered over 2 decades. Aligning, welding, inspecting. His movements were efficient, almost mechanical, born of muscle memory so deep it felt etched into his bones. He was good at it, damn good. A reliable cog in a massive machine, indispensable in his small corner, yet entirely replaceable in the grand scheme. He'd punch out, the tired fluorescent lights of the locker room casting long, weary shadows, and drive back, the evening traffic a mirror image of the morning's commute. Dinner, a few mumbled words with the kids about their day, a quiet evening with Maria watching whatever was on TV, maybe some bills spread out on the table. Another envelope on the counter, unopened, but he already knew what it was. The electric bill a little higher this month. The phone bill due next week. Maria's new medication not fully covered by insurance. The numbers never quite added up the way they should, always requiring a little more stretching, a little more tightening of the belt. The constant hum of financial anxiety was as ever-present as the factory noise, just quieter, more insidious. Sometimes, in those quiet moments after everyone else was asleep, Vince would find himself staring at the faded blueprint he'd tacked to the inside of his shed door years ago, a design for a specialized welding jig, his own idea, something that could cut production time by a quarter. He'd spent months on it, perfecting every angle, every pivot point. It was elegant, efficient, a testament to his practical ingenuity. He'd shown it to a supervisor once, years ago. The supervisor, a man named Henderson with eyes that only saw profit margins and quarterly reports, had grunted. "Good idea, Vince. Submit it through official channels." Vince had hesitated, paralyzed by the thought of rejection, of having his carefully crafted idea dissected, dismissed, perhaps even stolen without credit. He'd tucked it away, telling himself it wasn't the right time, that the company had its own engineers for that kind of thing. Those dreams, those quiet aspirations, were heavy, like stones pressing down on his chest, reminding him of paths not taken, chances not seized. He'd stand at the window, mug of coffee cooling in his hands, watching the first blush of dawn paint the sky. And sometimes, for just a fleeting second, he'd remember the boy who used to draw blueprints for treehouses that were practically mansions, who dreamed of building things that were his own from the ground up. The man he was now could spot a hairline fracture in a steel beam from 20 feet away, measure tolerances down to 1/1000th of an inch, his attention to detail unmatched on the factory floor. But when it came to measuring the risks of his own life, of his own potential, his hand trembled, his mind flooded with 1,000 catastrophic what-ifs. What if it failed? What if he lost the little they had? What if he looked foolish? The voices of self-doubt were loud in his head, mocking the quiet yearning, telling him he wasn't good enough. It was too late, stick to what you know. He watched others take those leaps, sometimes with envy, sometimes with a quiet scorn for their recklessness, always with that gnawing feeling that he was missing something essential, something vital to truly living. The gap between the man he was and the man he'd once dreamed of becoming felt wider every year, a chasm carved out by fear and inaction. The crack in Vince's meticulously constructed wall of safety began subtly, a faint tremor that he initially tried to ignore, like a minor rattle in a machine he'd rather not take apart. It wasn't a single explosive event, but a slow, insidious erosion, starting with a phone call from Maria, her voice tight, carefully controlled, telling him about the doctor's visit, about the word fibroid, and the recommended procedure. The words themselves were benign enough, common even, but the underlying current of worry in her tone, the way she downplayed it, sent a cold spike of dread through Vince. They had good insurance, sure, the kind that came with his union job, a steady paycheck for 22 years. He'd always prided himself on that. Dependable, secure. But good never meant free, and the copays, the deductibles, the lost time began to sketch out a new, unfamiliar column in the mental ledger he kept running constantly in his head. Just a few thousand, maybe. But a few thousand was rent on 2 months of quiet comfort, or school supplies for a year, or a trip to see Maria's ailing mother. He saw the worried glances Maria gave him, the way she'd squeeze his hand a little tighter when they watched the evening news, where stories of layoffs and economic uncertainty were becoming less background noise and more a direct broadcast from their own anxious future. Then the whispers started at the factory. Slowdowns, reduced shifts. The new contract with the auto manufacturer had stalled, someone said. Old man Henderson, who'd been on the floor since Vince was a kid, was taking early retirement, though everyone knew it wasn't his choice. Vince felt the hours shrinking on his own time card, the familiar hum of the machinery growing fainter, the once unshakable foundation beneath his feet starting to tremble. He'd always told himself that as long as he kept his head down, did his job, he was untouchable. Now, untouchable felt like a naive fantasy. It was during one of those reduced shifts, nursing a lukewarm coffee in the break room, that he saw Leo pull up in his new, shiny HVAC service van. Leo, who Vince had always dismissed as a bit of a wild card, a guy who'd quit the factory floor 5 years ago to try his hand at something else. Vince had scoffed then, shaking his head at the foolishness of leaving a good, steady job. Leo had been a decent mechanic, no doubt, but taking that kind of jump? Reckless. But now Leo wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. He waved at Vince, a broad, confident smile on his face, calling out, "Hey Vince, got another big job down in Riverside, expanding the crew next month." Leo's work truck wasn't just new, it had his company's logo, sharp and professional, painted on the side. He'd seen Leo's family at the grocery store too, looking rested, unhurried, buying the good stuff. The contrast hit Vince with the force of a physical blow. His own world contracting, Leo's expanding. The reckless one was building something. The safe one was watching his carefully constructed security crumble around him. That night, Vince couldn't find sleep. 3 a.m. came and went, the digital glow of the alarm clock a cruel, silent judge. He lay on his back, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, the familiar shadows of their bedroom transformed into oppressive shapes, pressing down on him. Maria was asleep beside him, her breathing soft and even a stark contrast to the hurricane raging inside his own head. His calculations ran on an endless loop. The projected medical bills for Maria's procedure, the reduced hours at the factory that meant a smaller paycheck, the rising cost of groceries, Alina's college fund, Leo's braces. Every number was a brick falling from his wall. He'd always prided himself on being the provider, the rock, the one who kept the wolves from the door. But now he felt less like a rock and more like a sieve, leaking precious resources, his hands empty. What had his life become? A carefully maintained prison built with bricks of what if and mortar of better not. He saw his reflection in the dark window pane, a ghost of the man he was, tired, etched with worry. He saw the potential he'd buried, the ideas he'd dismissed, the chances he'd let slip by, all out of a paralyzing fear of loss. He hadn't been protecting his family, he had been limiting them. He hadn't been providing security, he had been ensuring stagnation. The silence of the house was deafening, amplifying the brutal honesty of his own thoughts. He'd played it safe. He'd done everything right. And for what? To be terrified, helpless when the unexpected inevitably arrived. He saw Leo's confident smile, the shine of his new truck, and a bitter truth clawed its way up from the depths of Vince's gut. Fear, his constant companion, his trusted advisor, hadn't saved him from anything. It had only ensured he had nothing to fall back on, no alternative, no escape plan. His fear wasn't a shield, it was a cage. And he'd built it himself, brick by agonizing brick, locking himself and his family inside. The realization was a raw, aching wound, deep and undeniable. He had spent his entire adult life watching others build, while he had been too scared to even pick up a hammer. And now the floor was collapsing. The floor was collapsing, and the first tremor wasn't a distant rumble, but a sharp, sudden crack right under his feet. It came on a Tuesday afternoon, a call from Maria's doctor. Not just a routine checkup. They needed to do more tests. It was cancer, early stage, treatable, they said. Treatable. The word hung in the air like a cruel joke because treatable meant bills. Big bills. Bills that scoffed at his carefully balanced budgets, bills that laughed at his modest savings account, bills that saw his safe factory job and raised an eyebrow. Vince stood in the kitchen, the phone still warm in his hand, looking at Maria's pale face. Her eyes, usually so vibrant, were clouded with a fear that mirrored his own, but for her it was personal. For him, it was a tsunami hitting his meticulously built sandcastle. He heard the doctor's calm, professional voice again, explaining procedures, costs, recovery times. Each word was a brick crumbling from his carefully constructed wall of security. That night, Maria cried softly in the dark, and Vince lay awake, listening, his own chest a tight knot of dread. His path, the safe, paved one he'd chosen, suddenly felt like a dead-end street with a chasm opening up ahead. Then, just a week later, as if the universe was determined to rub salt in the wound, the news came from the factory. Hours cut. Not for everyone, not across the board, just his department. A temporary adjustment, they called it. Temporary. Maria's treatment wasn't temporary. The mortgage wasn't temporary. Alina's school trips, Leo's braces, the grocery bill, none of it was temporary. He saw the numbers in his head, the gap between what was coming in and what was going out widening into a gaping maw. And that's when his gaze snagged on Leo's truck, still parked in the driveway, shining under the street lamp. Leo, his friend, who'd worked in the same department for years. A man Vince had always admired for his easygoing nature, but secretly judged for his perceived recklessness. A few years back, Leo had started dabbling in a side hustle, fixing up old engines and selling them online. Vince had called it a fool's errand, a distraction from real work, a waste of money better saved. But when the factory cuts came, Leo just shrugged. "Yeah, it stings a bit," he'd said, "but Maria's business is humming along nicely, keeps us afloat." Maria, Leo's wife, who helped him with the online listings and the paperwork. Their business. Not a dream, not a gamble, but a solid, functioning, growing enterprise that was now providing for their family while Vince's world imploded. Vince's stomach churned. He remembered countless conversations with Leo over beers after a shift, Leo enthusiastically talking about researching engine models, about learning welding, about the satisfaction of bringing something old back to life. Vince had listened, polite but dismissive, always coming back to the dangers, the time commitment, the risk of failure. What if it doesn't work out? What if you lose money? Better to stick to what you know. Those words, his own words, echoed in his mind, mocking him. The brutal honesty that had clawed at him a few days prior intensified, becoming an unbearable weight. He lay there, unable to sleep, the quiet ticking of the hall clock the only sound in the house, each tick a reminder of the time he'd wasted. What had his life become? Not just a prison, but a collapsing one. He had believed the safest path was always the one already paved, and now the pavement had crumbled into dust beneath his feet. He watched others build, Leo being the most painful example, building something tangible, something that offered resilience, while Vince had been too paralyzed by what if to act on his own quiet aspirations. He saw Alina's face, worried and trying to hide it, asking about college tuition a little too casually. He saw Leo's eager eyes, already planning a future that might now be out of reach. His deep-seated anxiety about financial security wasn't just a nagging voice anymore. It was a screaming siren, blaring the truth that his inaction was the real destroyer. His fear of failure hadn't saved him from anything. It had guaranteed that when a real crisis hit, he had no reserves, no backup plan, no self-made lifeboat. The biggest gamble wasn't trying something new. The biggest gamble was doing absolutely nothing. He'd played it safe right into a trap. And the trap was closing, and in that suffocating darkness, something in Vince snapped. It wasn't a violent break, no shout, no fist slammed on the mattress. It was quieter, deeper, a seismic shift in his core. And enough of the gnawing fear that had been his constant companion, his supposed protector. Enough of the what if not, the endless loop of worst-case scenarios that had become his personal cage. Enough of watching the world turn from the sidelines, convinced that staying still was safety, when in truth, it was a slow, agonizing surrender. He lay there, rigid, staring at the unseen ceiling, and for the first time in years, he didn't just feel the crushing weight of his life. He rejected it with every fiber of his being. He didn't know what enough meant, not yet. There was no grand plan that magically appeared in the darkness, no sudden epiphany of a brilliant business idea, no magic solution whispered by the dawn. All he had was a raw, absolute certainty, a conviction that settled deep in his bones. He couldn't keep doing this. He couldn't keep building a life based on avoiding problems instead of confronting them, of merely surviving instead of truly living. He couldn't keep risking everything, his family's future, his own quiet aspirations, by risking nothing at all. The thought itself of stepping into the unknown was terrifying, a sharp blade of anxiety. But the alternative, continuing down this crumbling, fear-paved path, was infinitely more so. It wasn't courage, not yet. It was desperation hardening into resolve. The alarm clock blared at 5 a.m., slicing through the remnants of the night. For years, that sound had been a summons to another day of predictable monotony, a dull drumbeat keeping time with his slow surrender to the inevitable. This morning, however, it felt different. It was still a summons, yes, but now it carried the weight of a challenge, a dare to see if the quiet, enough from the darkness, could withstand the harsh light of day. He swung his legs out of bed, the worn carpet cool beneath his feet, a small shiver running up his spine that had nothing to do with the morning chill. Maria stirred beside him but didn't wake, her even breathing a familiar comfort, now tinged with the new, urgent burden of her diagnosis. Vince moved through the familiar morning ritual, the gurgle of the coffee maker, the satisfying click of the toaster, but his mind wasn't on the factory floor, not anymore. It was on Leo. Leo, his friend who had risked his meager savings, spent his evenings poring over books and manuals, learning about small engine repair. Leo, who in Vince's past judgment had been reckless, had actually taken a calculated leap after careful research, turning a modest skill into a resilient lifeline for his family when the factory faltered. Vince, sitting at his kitchen table, the half-eaten toast growing cold, now saw the truth that had been hidden by his own fear. It wasn't recklessness. It was calculation, the meticulous homework, and then the guts to swing. His own fear, a familiar phantom, instantly materialized, whispering its ancient warnings. What are you even thinking? You're not a businessman. You'll just mess things up worse. You're too old. It's too late. The factory whistle would blow soon, its mournful wail signaling the start of another day, and the familiar delivery truck would soon rumble down the street. The easy, safe, suffocating path beckoned, promising predictable exhaustion over the terrifying uncertainty of change. His hand hovered over his phone, heavy with indecision. He could just scroll through the news, pretend he was looking for an update on something trivial, let the fear win, let the day swallow him whole into the usual routine. But the quiet enough from the dark night still resonated, a low, persistent hum beneath the panic. He remembered Leo talking about free online courses, about local business resources, things Vince had scoffed at, dismissed as pipe dreams. Now his fingers, despite their trembling, started to type. Small business resources local, he typed, his thumbs stiff, fumbling slightly on the small keyboard. Online courses metal fabrication. He didn't know what he was looking for precisely, but he was looking. He was doing. The first few clicks led to generic ads, overwhelming government sites, the kind of digital clutter that usually made him shut down in frustration. He almost closed the laptop. The old habit, the fear-driven paralysis, was powerful, almost irresistible. It's too much. You can't do this. Just go to work, Vince. It's what you know. He took a deep, shaky breath, the metallic tang of fear sharp in his mouth. He scrolled down past the flashy promises and vague advice. Then, buried 3 pages deep in the search results, a small, unassuming link caught his eye. Community college evening programs, advanced welding and entrepreneurial skills for tradesmen. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't a magic bullet. It was just a step. A hard, uncomfortable, terrifying step away from the meticulously paved path he'd clung to for so long. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of both dread and a strange, nascent excitement. He could ignore it. He should ignore it. Who had time for evening classes after a grueling factory shift, who had the money for tuition when Maria's medical bills were already piling up. But for once, the questions weren't about what he stood to lose by trying. They were about what he might gain, and more profoundly about what he had already lost by doing absolutely nothing. He clicked the link, the sound of the mouse button, a small, defiant pop in the quiet kitchen. The registration form appeared, stark white against the screen, demanding attention. He started to read, his brow furrowed in concentration, tracing the words with a slow finger. The factory truck honked its familiar greeting outside, a short, impatient blast. Vince, for the first time in years, ignored it completely. That first evening class felt like a foreign country. Vince, still smelling faintly of hydraulic fluid and machine grease, walked into the brightly lit classroom at the community college. It was a utilitarian space, linoleum floors reflecting the harsh fluorescent light. A whiteboard at the front covered in equations he couldn't yet decipher. He was tired, bone-deep tired. His shoulders ached from a day of lifting and turning, his eyes heavy from staring at the same repetitive motions for 8 hours straight. Every fiber of his being screamed for his worn armchair, a hot meal, and an hour of peace before bed. But he sat down, in the back row, a stranger among younger faces and a few men who looked his age but carried a different kind of weariness. The instructor, a no-nonsense woman with safety glasses perched on her head, started talking about material properties and arc stability. It was like listening to a different language. His mind, accustomed to the rhythmic clang of the factory, struggled to keep up with the flow of information, the new terms, the complex diagrams. He felt a dull ache behind his eyes, a phantom headache trying to pull him under. He gripped his pen, knuckles white, forcing himself to focus, to write down every word, even if half of it felt like gibberish. The next few weeks were a blur of exhaustion. The 5 a.m. alarm still ripped him from sleep, but now the nights were shorter, filled with textbooks spread across the kitchen table, illuminated by a single too-bright lamp. Maria would often find him there, slumped over a diagram of a flux-cord wire, the empty coffee mug a silent testament to his fight. She'd lay a hand on his shoulder, a silent question in her touch. He'd just grunt, rub his eyes, and dive back into it. Alina and Leo, used to seeing their dad on the couch by 7 p.m., now heard the quiet rustle of pages and the soft click of his laptop late into the night. He felt a pang of guilt, that gnawing feeling that he was short-changing them, sacrificing present moments for a future that was still just a hazy maybe. Some days, the doubt was a physical weight pressing him down. After a particularly demanding shift, where a machine broke down and he had to work through his lunch to fix it, he drove to class with lead in his shoes. He barely made it through the door before the instructor announced a pop quiz. He stared at the questions, his mind a blank, a swirling void of fatigue and self-pity. He got a D, a stinging, undeniable D. His stomach dropped, a cold knot forming in his gut. "See?" a voice sneered inside his head. "You're too old for this. You're not smart enough. You're just wasting time and money you don't have." The old fear, the paralysis, threatened to engulf him, to drag him back into the safe, numb mediocrity he was trying to escape. He thought about quitting, every single day. He imagined himself walking out of class, driving home, and sinking into the familiar oblivion of the couch. He longed for it, yearned for the release from this constant, grinding pressure. There were nights he'd almost done it, almost called the college to withdraw. He'd even drafted the email in his head, the words, due to unforeseen circumstances, feeling like a betrayal and a relief all at once. One Saturday morning, after a particularly late night of studying, he snapped at Leo for spilling his cereal. The boy's eyes, wide and hurt, pierced through Vince's tired fog. Later, watching Maria gently clean up the mess, her movements a little slower than they used to be, a sharp, cold clarity cut through his exhaustion. He remembered the doctor's words, the careful way Maria had held back her own fear. He remembered the factory's shortened hours, the sudden fragility of his safe life. He remembered Frank, his peer, not just surviving but thriving because he'd taken that calculated risk. His D on the quiz stung, yes. But the thought of Maria's medical bills, the thought of his children's future being dictated by a factory whistle, the thought of going back to that empty, admiring distance, watching others build while he stood frozen by what if, that stung worse. Far, far worse. He took a deep breath, the taste of stale coffee on his tongue. He found the quiz in his backpack. He looked at the questions he'd gotten wrong. Then, painstakingly, he looked up the correct answers. He stayed up another hour that night, rereading the chapters, his brow furrowed, his jaw set. It wasn't about being smart, he realized. It was about outworking the fear. It was about proving to that sneering voice in his head that his resolve, forged in years of quiet responsibility, was tougher than any doubt it could throw at him. He wouldn't quit. He couldn't. Not when the cost of quitting was so much higher than the cost of trying. The resolve, clear and sharp in the dead of night, began to fray around the edges by day 3. That 4:30 a.m. alarm, which had sounded like a trumpet call for change just a couple of mornings ago, now felt like a brutal assault. His body, used to hitting the floor at 5, screamed for another hour, maybe 2. Every muscle ached with the fatigue that only comes from a day spent on your feet, followed by a restless night, followed by more work. He lay there, eyes squeezed shut, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator, the distant rumble of an early train. Just 5 more minutes, a voice, familiar and insidious, whispered in his ear. "What's the rush? You're tired. One night won't hurt." He smelled Maria's shampoo on her pillow, felt the warmth of her breathing beside him. He saw Leo's scraped knee from yesterday, Alina's worried frown when she'd seen the doctor's bill for her mother's tests. The whisper turned to a snarl of self-pity. He forced his eyes open. The numbers on the alarm clock glowed a menacing red. He pushed himself up, swung his legs over the side of the bed. The cold floor shocked his feet awake. Every step to the kitchen was heavy, each movement a conscious effort against the pull of exhaustion. The coffee, black and bitter, was less a comfort and more a jolt to the system. He opened the book, the same complex diagrams and endless paragraphs waiting for him, and felt a wave of profound discouragement wash over him. By day 7, the initial spark had dwindled to a stubborn ember. He hadn't just gotten tired, he'd gotten bored. The material, once a source of urgent focus, now felt like a dense, impenetrable wall of text. He'd scored another C on a practice quiz online. A familiar knot tightened in his stomach. What was the point? He was a factory man, not a scholar. This whole idea, this trying to be someone he wasn't, felt like a fool's errand. One evening, after putting in a double shift at the factory to make up for some lost hours, he came home to a darkened house. Maria and the kids were already asleep. His studying for the night felt impossible. He slumped onto the sofa, the weight of the world pressing down on him. He saw the untouched textbook on the kitchen table, the half-empty coffee cup from that morning. "Just skip it tonight," the voice returned, louder this time, more convincing. "You earned a break. One night won't break you." He closed his eyes, almost drifting off. It would be so easy, just stop. But then out of the quiet, his mind conjured an image. Frank standing tall and confident, talking about his plans, providing for his family when the factory had turned its back. Vince remembered Maria's pale face, the way she'd squeezed his hand on the way out of the doctor's office. He remembered the tremor in his own hand when he'd opened that first scary bill. This wasn't about him being smart enough or good enough. This was about being responsible enough. He forced his eyelids open, pushed himself off the couch. His legs still felt like lead. His mind was screaming for rest. He walked to the table, picked up the textbook. He didn't want to. Every fiber of his being resisted, but he didn't give in to the resistance. He sat down, opened the book, and started reading. He didn't absorb every word. Some paragraphs he had to read 3 times, but he kept going. He stayed up until the streetlights outside flickered off, until the first hint of gray lightened the eastern sky. He finished the chapter. It wasn't glorious, it wasn't easy, but he hadn't quit. He had simply outlasted the doubt. Day 14 brought a fresh wave of disappointment. A major online test for his course, one he'd studied days for, had him stumped on a few key questions. He de-guessed and guessed wrong. The score flashed red. A solid D. His heart sank heavy and cold in his chest. C. The voice sneered, a full-blown mocking laugh this time. You're not cut out for this. You're just wasting your time, your money, your sleep. You're going to fail, and you'll drag everyone down with you. He wanted to smash his fist against the table. He wanted to throw the laptop across the room. He felt the familiar, crushing weight of inadequacy. He went to work that day with a dark cloud hanging over him, moving through his tasks like a ghost. At lunch, he picked at his sandwich. "Everything all right, Vince?" asked one of the younger guys, usually too busy with his phone to notice anyone else. Vince just grunted. But later, watching the metal press stamp out parts, the rhythmic thump-thump, a monotonous beat, he felt something else stir beneath the despair. It wasn't anger this time. It was a cold, hard defiance. He'd failed a test. So what? He'd failed 1,000 small things in his life. Projects that didn't go as planned at the factory, attempts to fix things around the house that only made them worse. He hadn't given up on any of those. He'd fixed them, learned from them, or found another way. Why was this any different? He thought of the relentless, unyielding nature of the machines he worked with, how they just kept going, hour after hour, despite resistance, despite wear and tear. That's what he had to be? Relentless. That night, he didn't just review the questions he got wrong. He spent an hour researching why they were wrong. He found supplementary videos online, articles that broke down the concepts in simpler terms. He still felt the sting of failure, but it was a different kind of sting now, a sharp reminder that he had more to learn, not a death sentence. He wasn't giving up. Not yet. Not ever. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm Vince had never known. The factory still demanded its 8 hours, the machines still hummed and clanked, but his evenings were no longer spent in passive resignation. The laptop, once a symbol of his inadequacy, became his nightly sparring partner. He didn't just study, he deconstructed. He'd pause the videos, scribble notes on any scrap of paper he could find, reread passages until the words no longer looked like gibberish, until the numbers started to make sense. He started seeing patterns, connections he'd missed before. The fear hadn't vanished entirely. It was a dull ache, a constant hum in the background, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was a fuel, a cold, hard reminder of what he was fighting for, what he stood to lose if he didn't fight. He treated each concept like a stubborn part on an assembly line. If it didn't fit, he wouldn't force it. He'd figure out why it didn't fit, then adjust the process. Maria noticed it first. She'd come into the living room expecting to find him staring blankly at the news, and instead he'd be hunched over the screen, sometimes muttering to himself, explaining a concept out loud. "What's got into you, Vince?" she asked one evening, a faint smile playing on her lips, a worried crease between her brows easing a little. He just shrugged, a little embarrassed, but didn't stop. He was sleeping less, but felt more awake, more present than he had in years. The tired lines around his eyes were still there, but now they seemed to hold a new spark, a quiet determination. Elena, his daughter, caught him one night sketching out an electrical diagram, something completely foreign to him months ago. "Dad, what are you doing?" she asked, genuinely curious. He looked up, surprised, then smiled slightly. "Learning how things really work, kiddo, beyond the surface." It was a conversation, a connection they hadn't had in ages. At work, he found himself applying the same meticulous approach to the factory floor. He'd always been thorough, but now he was observant in a different way. He wasn't just fixing a jammed machine. He was tracing the fault, understanding the why behind the breakdown, looking for preventative measures he might have overlooked before. He started asking more questions, not out of doubt, but out of genuine curiosity, a hunger for understanding. Ever think about rerouting that cooling line, Jerry? He'd ask the lead engineer, pointing to a spot others just accepted as how it's always been. Jerry, a man who rarely looked up from his blueprints, initially dismissed Vince with a grunt. But Vince persisted, not with aggression, but with well-researched reasoning, citing efficiency gains and reduced wear. Slowly, Jerry started to listen, nodding, even sketching out Vince's suggestions. Vince wasn't just doing his job, he was engaging with it, seeing potential improvements everywhere, the machinery of the factory no longer just a repetitive chore, but a complex puzzle to be optimized. He felt a different kind of satisfaction, a quiet pride in contributing beyond just punching in and out. Then came the second test. He'd barely slept the night before, the old anxiety bubbling up like a toxic brew in his gut. But this time, it felt different. It was less about the fear of failure and more about the fear of not knowing, of not having done absolutely everything in his power. He walked into the community center's small classroom, the fluorescent lights humming, his palms slick with a familiar sweat. He picked up the pencil, his hand steady despite the tremor in his chest. When he turned the page, a quiet confidence, hard-won and fragile, settled over him. He knew the material. He didn't second-guess himself on every answer, didn't let the what-ifs cloud his judgment. He recalled the hours spent at the kitchen table, the late nights, the times he wanted to quit. He saw Maria's worried but hopeful face, Alina's quiet support, Leo's casual glances. He filled in the bubbles, one by one, with a steady hand, feeling each answer land with the weight of preparation. A week later, the email arrived. He opened it in the solitude of his car during lunch break, his thumb hovering over the screen, the silence deafening. "Congratulations, Vince. You passed with an 88%. He read it again, and again, an 88%. It wasn't perfect, but it was miles beyond what he dared to hope. A slow, unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest, expanding with each breath. It wasn't just about the score, it was about the journey to get there. He hadn't just studied, he'd fought. He'd stared down the fear of looking stupid, the fear of wasting time, the fear of failing again, and he'd kept pushing. He thought of his friend, the one who'd seemed so reckless, but who had in fact taken his own carefully considered leap. Vince realized he hadn't been reckless, he'd been prepared. He'd done his homework, assessed the risks, and then he'd acted. That was the difference. That night, Maria found him not at the computer, but in the small backyard under the glow of the porch light. He was kneeling, meticulously tending to a stubborn patch of weeds that had been choking out her prized rose bushes. He was digging deep, pulling them out by the root, not just snipping the tops, getting rid of the problem permanently. "Hey," she said softly, sitting beside him on the weathered bench, the scent of damp earth and roses filling the air. He looked up, a faint smudge of dirt on his cheek, a genuine, easy smile on his face. "I passed," he said simply, the words carrying more weight than just a test score. She didn't need to ask what. She knew. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers tracing the calluses that told stories of a lifetime of hard work, but now a new chapter. "I knew you would," she whispered, her eyes shining with unshed tears, a quiet hope blossoming in her own chest. For the first time in a long time, Vince felt a profound sense of peace mixed with exhilaration. He wasn't out of the woods yet, not by a long shot, but he wasn't lost in the dark anymore. He had a compass now, and it pointed forward. He understood that true security wasn't found in avoiding risks, but in understanding them, preparing for them, and having the courage to take them. The biggest gamble wasn't trying. It was letting fear convince you to stand still, watching your potential empires crumble before you even picked up a hammer. He felt the stirrings of an empire within himself, finally ready to be built. Vince finally understood. The safe life he had painstakingly built, brick by careful brick, had always been an illusion. Maria's diagnosis had shown him that. It had been a controlled demolition of his comfort zone, revealing the flimsy foundations beneath. He'd feared ruin, but ruin had come knocking from an unexpected direction, not from a risk he took, but from life simply happening. He thought of Marco, always laughing, always tinkering with some new idea. Vince used to shake his head, pitying Marco for his reckless abandon, for daring to step off the well-worn path. But Marco hadn't been reckless. He'd been diligent, researching, testing, learning. He deep-pored over spreadsheets and customer feedback, not unlike Vince meticulously checking a machine's specs. The difference wasn't in the attention to detail. It was in the courage to apply that detail to something new. Marco had built something, a small, thriving business that now supported his family when the factory faltered. Vince, for all his caution, had merely maintained. He had kept the parts moving but never built anything new. His hammer, the tool of creation, had gathered dust, gripped tightly by a hand paralyzed by fear. That was the real gamble. Not trying, not picking up the hammer. not even drawing up the blueprints. It was letting fear destroy potential empires before they even had a chance to rise. He'd spent his life admiring from a distance, watching others build, while his own aspirations withered in the shadows of what if. He had traded the promise of growth for the illusion of security, and the exchange had nearly cost him everything. This isn't about throwing caution to the wind, he realized. It's about calculated courage. It's about doing your homework, understanding the odds, and then having the guts to swing. It's about recognizing that sometimes the only way to truly build security is to dare to build something new. The rose bushes swayed gently in the evening breeze, there sent a sweet promise. Maria stirred beside him, her presence a grounding warmth. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of unspoken understanding, of shared battles fought and new horizons glimpsed. Vince knew the fear wouldn't vanish entirely. It was a shadow that walked with every man. But now he knew how to face it. He knew it wasn't a wall, but a gate that swung open only when you found the courage to push against it. He looked at his hands, no longer just the hands of a factory worker, but the hands of a man ready to build. And in the quiet of that night, as the stars began to pepper the inky canvas above their modest home, Vince understood a truth as old as time itself, a truth whispered by every brave soul.